The village, a forgotten huddle of slate and stone, clung to the coast like a barnacle. Here, in the persistent embrace of the mist, time seemed to dilate, its edges blurring into an indistinct gray. My observatory, a solitary dome of white against the perpetually shrouded sky, stood sentinel on the highest bluff, a lonely beacon of inquiry in the heart of the foggy village. Mornings for me, Grand Chen, began not with the sun, but with the hum of electronics, the low thrumming pulse of my instruments awakening. I preferred the silence of the pre-dawn, the world still hushed, offering no distractions from the vast, indifferent tapestry above. My life had long been a dedication to the remote, the unseen. I sought the whisper of ancient light, the echoes of cosmic birth. The human world felt distant, a cacophony I willingly muted. My days unfolded within the gentle glow of monitors, the rhythmic tap of keys, the scent of ozone and stale coffee clinging to the air. I tracked distant quasars, mapped the intricate dance of nebulae, and patiently sifted through the incessant static of the cosmos, hoping for a fleeting glimpse of something truly new. Today, however, carried a different current. A subtle tremor had been running through my data for weeks, a persistent, almost imperceptible anomaly that defied categorization. It was a phantom, an echo that didn't fit the known parameters of celestial mechanics, a melody played on an instrument not yet invented. My colleagues, when I had still bothered with such interactions, would have dismissed it as noise, an equipment glitch, or perhaps a transient burst of unknown origin. I moved with a quiet urgency, my fingers dancing across the console. Every sensor had been checked, every cable traced. Yet, the anomaly persisted, a stubborn, beautiful stain on the pristine canvas of my expectations. My screen flickered, displaying the latest raw feed. A series of complex waveforms scrolled across the display, a chaotic symphony of peaks and troughs. For days, I had tried to impose order upon them, to force them into familiar trigonometric functions, to find a harmonic progression. They resisted. They were not linear. They were not cyclical in any conventional sense. They pulsed with an internal logic that felt profoundly alien to the mathematics I knew, a geometry that bent back on itself in impossible ways. "Show me the spectral analysis," I murmured to the system, my voice a low rumble in the quiet room. The data shifted, coalescing into a vibrant, undulating spectrum. Instead of the familiar lines and bands of known elements, a sprawling, fractal pattern emerged, intricate and self-repeating, yet never quite resolving into a recognizable form. It was a tapestry woven from chaos, an impossible knot of information. The very act of observing it felt like peering into a forbidden dimension, a glimpse of structures that should not exist within the orderly framework of our universe. This was not merely an unknown. This was a violation. My mind, trained to find order, to impose sense, recoiled from the sheer illogicality of the patterns. They defied Euclidean space, mocking the very foundations of my discipline. The signal wasn't just distant, it felt other. It was a message composed in a grammar I could not parse, a language that warped the very concept of syntax. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the monitor. The fractal patterns seemed to deepen, to draw me into their impossible convolutions. A faint, almost subliminal hum began to resonate within the room, a low frequency that bypassed my ears and vibrated directly in my chest. It was not from the speakers, it was an internal resonance, a sympathetic vibration within my own skull. The room itself felt subtly distorted, the familiar angles of the console seeming to waver at the periphery of my vision. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard. I could dismiss this, attribute it to fatigue, to the isolation, to the insidious damp of the foggy village finally seeping into my mind. But the evidence was there, undeniable, a persistent, beautiful obscenity against the backdrop of cosmic order. This signal, whatever it was impossible. And yet, here it was, radiating its non-Euclidean truth into my carefully constructed reality. A profound unease settled upon me, a premonition of something vast and terrible beginning to stir at the edges of my comprehension. My scientific curiosity, once a pure, guiding light, now felt like a desperate, dangerous compulsion. I had found something, yes. But I feared what it had found in me. The hum intensified, a low, insistent throb that promised to unravel more than just data. It promised to unravel me. The observatory, a solitary pearl against the bruised gray of the foggy village, became my anchor, my cage, my entire universe. Outside, the mist, a living shroud, never lifted, and its spectral embrace seemed to seep through the very walls, dampening the world beyond my dome. Inside, however, a feverish clarity reigned, driven by the pulsating enigma on my screens. The signal, a phantom limb of existence, demanded every synapse, every waking breath. I had not truly slept since its first whispered intrusion. Hours dissolved into a seamless current, marked only by the shifting luminescence of the displays and the deepening ache behind my eyes. My meals, forgotten plates of congealed food, stood as silent monuments to my neglect. All that mattered was the signal, a tapestry woven from impossibilities. Its patterns defied every known mathematical construct, every elegant law of the cosmos I had spent a lifetime internalizing. I saw symmetries that dissolved upon closer inspection, revealing deeper, more fragmented forms. There were sequences that repeated, yet each iteration carried a subtle, fundamental difference, like a melody played by an instrument whose very tuning shifted with every note. My custom algorithms, designed to dissect the most arcane astrophysical data, crumpled before its alien logic. They churned, spat errors, then choked into silence, unable to reconcile the data with any conceivable framework. Impossible, I whispered, the word a dry rasp against my parched throat. My fingers, numb from endless keystrokes, danced across the console. The air in the dome, thick with the hum of machinery and the scent of ozone, felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken truths. I zoomed into a particular segment, a burst of energy that appeared as a jagged, crystalline structure on the spectral analysis. It twisted, not in 3 dimensions, but in some phantom space beyond my comprehension. Its edges were sharp, yet paradoxically soft, blurring the line between solid and void. I spent an entire day, perhaps 2, fixated on this single burst. I ran every filter, every transform, every statistical analysis I possessed. The frustration coiled in my gut, a living thing. It was like trying to grasp smoke or hold water in a sieve. Just as I thought I had isolated a repeating motif, a core geometric principle, the pattern would subtly reconfigure itself. It wasn't merely complex, it was dynamic, actively shifting its own fundamental rules in response to my attempts to categorize it. It was as if the signal itself was aware of my scrutiny, morphing just beyond the reach of my understanding. My fascination, a dangerous ember, flared into an inferno. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a defiant declaration against the bedrock of reality. The universe, I had believed, operated on immutable principles, elegant and predictable. I leaned closer to the monitor, my reflection, a gaunt stranger with bloodshot eyes, staring back. The lines on the screen seemed to writhe, their vibrant hues bleeding into each other. Was it the strain, the relentless hours, or was the signal itself beginning to infect my vision? I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the faint, shimmering distortions persisted at the periphery of my sight. Then, the event. Amidst the chaos of impossible geometries, a new element manifested. It wasn't a pattern, not a shape, not a frequency. It appeared not as a blank space, but as a deliberate removal of information, a precise excision. My breath hitched. This wasn't merely a gap in data, it was an intentional, impossibly precise cut. It was as if a sculptor had removed a piece of clay, not randomly, but with absolute purpose, creating a negative space that was as significant as the forms around it. What could carve such an absence into the fabric of a signal? This reveal shattered my remaining composure. The signal wasn't just defying physics, it was operating on principles so utterly alien they inverted understanding. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was something else. Something that bent reality to its own whim, not through force, but through an insidious, quiet subversion. The dome, once a sanctuary of scientific pursuit, began to feel like a pressure cooker. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of this impossible discovery. Outside, the fog pressed closer, and I imagined it not as natural vapor, but as a physical manifestation of the uncertainty now seeping into my very bones. A feverish devotion consumed me, burning brighter than any star. The observatory, my last bastion, hummed with the low thrum of machinery, a counterpoint to the relentless silence of the foggy village outside. I lived on lukewarm coffee and the desperate hope of an answer, my determination a brittle shield against the encroaching sense of futility. The signal. It was a phantom orchestra, playing a score no human ear was meant to hear, no human mind to comprehend. My data streams, usually a comforting tapestry of predictable waves and elegant curves, now writhed with impossible geometries. Triangles that folded into themselves, lines that converged only to diverge into new, alien planes. It wasn't just complex, it was fundamentally wrong, a violation of every spatial axiom I held dear. Each attempt to parse its patterns, to force it into a recognizable framework, felt like trying to grasp smoke. I pushed back from the console, rubbing my temples. The screens glowed, a cold, unblinking eye in the dimness of the dome. The mist outside pressed against the windows, a gray, formless threat. I imagined it seeping in, dissolving the walls, then my instruments, then me, leaving nothing but the endless, formless data of the signal. No, I muttered, the sound hoarse in my throat. This wasn't a problem to be solved with logic alone. Logic was a Euclidean tool, and this signal defied it. I needed a different approach. For weeks, I had been trying to deconstruct it, to break it down into constituent parts. What if the key lay not in dissection, but in synthesis? What if I needed to feel it, rather than just read it? I turned back to the main console, my fingers flying across the holographic interface, calling up my experimental filters. These were not for analysis, but for resonance. I had designed them out of a desperate, almost artistic impulse, hoping to find an echo, a sympathetic vibration, within the chaotic torrent. I isolated a particularly volatile cluster of patterns, a section that seemed to pulsate with an almost malevolent energy. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. With a deep breath, I engaged the filter. The screens flickered, the usual numerical readouts giving way to abstract, swirling colors, not data visualizations, but a raw, unfiltered interpretation. A low hum, deeper than the machinery, vibrated through the floor and up into my bones. Then, a sudden, blinding flash. Not of light, but of presence. It wasn't an image, nor a sound, nor a scent, yet it encompassed all of them, and none. I felt a fragment of the signal, not as data, but as a pure, unfiltered impression. It was a sensation of impossible vastness, of geometries folding in on themselves, of colors that burned without light, of sounds that echoed in a vacuum. My mind reeled, assaulted by a torrent of non-sensory information that bypassed my eyes, my ears, my very skin, plunging directly into the core of my being. I was somewhere else, or nowhere at all. A brief, vivid pseudo-dream unfurled within the blink of an eye. I stood on a precipice overlooking an ocean of shifting, impossible angles, where the sky was a lattice of fractured light and the air tasted of ancient dust and forgotten sorrow. Shapes that defied naming swam in the depths, their movements creating ripples in the fabric of space itself. A profound, crushing insignificance washed over me, stripping away my sense of self, my memories, everything that made me Chen. I was falling, endlessly falling, through dimensions that had no names, no existence. Then, just as suddenly, it snapped back. My head slammed forward onto the console, the impact jarring me back to the present. The screens, though still displaying the abstract colors, no longer pulsed with that invasive energy. The hum had receded. My breath hitched in my throat, ragged and shallow. My stomach churned, and a wave of vertigo threatened to topple me from my chair. I pushed myself upright, my limbs trembling, my vision blurring at the edges. The observatory, once my sanctuary, now felt alien, its familiar contours warped by the echo of what I had just experienced. The air tasted metallic, and my ears rang with a faint, persistent tone that wasn't there a moment before. What was that? It wasn't a hallucination in the traditional sense, it was too profound, too visceral. The fog outside, I noticed, seemed thicker, its gray embrace now feeling less like a shroud and more like a waiting maw. I had touched something, and it had touched me back, leaving me irrevocably altered. I craved only its patterns, its impossible geometry, convinced that within its alien syntax lay a truth more profound than any star chart. One morning, or perhaps it was evening, the light through the observatory's tall windows was a flat, gray sheet, courtesy of the persistent fog that clung to the village like a shroud. My vision, strained by hours of microscopic analysis, felt gritty, as if fine sand had settled beneath my eyelids. I pushed away from the console, the chair groaning in protest, and stretched, my muscles stiff and protesting. A cup of lukewarm coffee sat beside a stack of printouts, its surface filmed with an oily sheen. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for it, the tremor a testament to my exhaustion. As I lifted the mug, a movement in my peripheral vision snagged my attention. My head snapped around, but the curtain was precisely as it should be, motionless, its folds undisturbed. The window behind it offered only the featureless gray of the village beyond, a muted canvas of mist and unseen houses. I blinked, rubbing my temples. Fatigue, I murmured, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. Just tricks of the light. The observatory, after all, was an old building, prone to drafts and settling noises. Later, descending the creaking stairs to the small kitchen in my living quarters, I heard it again. A faint, impossible sound, like dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty plain, yet it seemed to emanate from within the walls. It was too delicate to be the wind, too rhythmic to be the old pipes groaning. I shook my head, dismissing it as the house settling, or perhaps the wind playing a strange tune through a loose pane. The old structure always had its eccentricities. The next afternoon, venturing into the foggy village for supplies, the world felt muted, indistinct. The usual chatter of the local shopkeeper seemed distant, muffled by the pervasive mist and an inexplicable hum that resonated in my ears. I picked up a loaf of bread, its crust still warm, and a carton of milk. As the shopkeeper, a woman with kind, crinkled eyes, weighed my purchases, I noticed a small, wooden bird figurine on the counter. I remembered seeing it there yesterday, perched on the edge of the till, facing towards the door. But today, it was turned inwards, its tiny, carved eyes staring directly at me, a silent, unsettling sentinel. It moved, I heard myself say, the words flat and strange in the quiet shop. Her eyes held a question I couldn't quite decipher. Sometimes my elbow catches things. I nodded, forcing a smile. The explanation felt thin, translucent. I distinctly remembered it facing the door. Had I imagined it? Had my memory, already frayed by sleepless nights, played a trick on me? The bird, in my mind, seemed to watch me, its wooden gaze unwavering. Back in the solitary confines of my observatory, the signal pulsed, a silent, insistent presence. I tried to immerse myself in its patterns, to lose myself in the comforting logic of its complexity, but the faint, impossible sounds returned. I told myself it was exhaustion, the strain of prolonged focus, the peculiar atmosphere of the foggy village. Yet, a seed had been planted, a tiny, unsettling kernel of doubt. What if it wasn't just my mind playing tricks? What if the world itself was beginning to subtly, imperceptibly, rearrange itself around me? The cold bread from the shop lay forgotten on my workbench, its crust growing brittle, a stark reminder of the morning's unease. Had it truly been there, or merely a phantom conjured by the ceaseless hum of the signal? My hands, despite the tremor that occasionally seized them, still knew their purpose. The screens before me glowed with an alien script, the signal's raw data a swirling tempest of non-Euclidean patterns that refused conventional analysis. I had retreated further, deeper into the secluded dwelling nestled on the fringes of the foggy village. The mist, an omnipresent shroud, clung to the windowpanes, blurring the world beyond into a watercolor of muted grays and greens. The silence here, broken only by the soft whir of my machines and the distant, muffled bleating of some unseen animal, was both a comfort and a profound terror. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting luminescence of my monitors. My determination was a raw, aching thing, fueled by an obsession that had consumed every waking thought, every fractured dream. The signal was a lock, and my mind, frayed and desperate, was the pick. I pored over the data, lines of code stretching into infinity, each symbol a fragment of an impossible language. My fingers, stained with ink and the faint sheen of sweat, danced across the holographic interface, coaxing patterns from the chaos. I wasn't just analyzing, I was feeling the data, letting its strange rhythm seep into my bones, guiding my intuition where logic failed. The conventional algorithms had yielded nothing but static, a cacophony of meaningless noise. But I had begun to develop a new approach, a recursive, self-correcting model designed to interpret structures that defied our three-dimensional understanding. It was a leap of faith, an act of intellectual desperation. I fed the processed fragments back into the system, an iterative loop, watching as the abstract symbols began to coalesce, to hint at something beyond their individual meaning. Then, a flicker. A tentative shimmer on the primary display. My breath caught in my throat, a dry rasp. The screen, previously a canvas of cascading numbers, began to ripple. Not in the way a computer screen glitches, but with an organic fluidity, like water disturbed by an unseen stone. The numbers dissolved, reforming into skeletal lines, tentative arcs that stretched and bent in ways my eyes struggled to comprehend. They were not flat, not merely projected. They possessed an impossible depth, a curvature that seemed to fold in on itself, defying the flat surface of the screen. I leaned closer, my forehead almost touching the cool glass. The nascent model, still rudimentary, was generating shapes that twisted, inverted, and reconfigured themselves without any discernible pivot point. A cube would suddenly become a sphere, not through transformation, but as if it had always been both, simultaneously. Edges melted into curves, then solidified into new, unexpected angles, all within the same impossible structure. It was a geometry of paradox, a visual representation of what I had only ever conceptualized as abstract mathematical impossibility. Yet, there it was, manifesting before me, a three-dimensional lattice of pure contradiction. A line would fork into three, then two of. Those branches would merge back into the original, all while maintaining their distinct existence. Surfaces would curve inward, only to reveal themselves as the outer boundary of a different, internal volume. It was a constant, fluid unraveling and reweaving of form, a dance of impossible dimensions. As the model grew more stable, its shifting geometries becoming more pronounced, a new sensation began to creep into my awareness. It wasn't the strain of concentration, nor the onset of another hallucination. This was different. This was external. A profound, palpable sense of being watched. It didn't come from the window, shrouded by the foggy village outside. It emanated from the data itself, from the impossible structures writhing on the screen. My skin crawled. The air in the room, already thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee, suddenly felt thin, suffocating. I pulled back from the screen, my chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. There was nothing. Only the pulsating, impossible geometries on the display, now seeming to pulse with a deliberate rhythm, as if breathing. The feeling intensified, not hostile, not benign, but utterly indifferent, utterly alien. It was the presence of something incomprehensibly vast, something that had simply noticed me. I was a mote of dust, caught in the beam of a cosmic searchlight. The reclusive comfort of my dwelling in the foggy village had evaporated, replaced by a terrible vulnerability. I was exposed, utterly naked, under the gaze of something that resided within the very fabric of the signal. It wasn't just data anymore. It was an eye. And it was looking back. It was a splinter, indeed, working its way deeper, festering into a raw certainty, something was amiss, profoundly so. My focus, once a laser beam, had become a frantic searchlight, sweeping across the chaotic beauty of the non-Euclidean patterns that pulsed across my displays. Each swirl of data, each impossible curve, seemed to vibrate with an unseen presence, a silent observer. I hadn't seen a colleague in days, not truly. I dodged the calls, let the insistent knocks on my lab door fade into the background hum of the machinery. They would see the wildness in my eyes, the tremor in my hands, the way I now spoke to the empty air, explaining the signal's logic to an invisible audience. They would dismiss it, of course, a grand delusion, the ravings of a mind stretched too thin. Or worse, they would see the potential, the terrifying, paradigm-shattering truth, and try to seize it, to dissect it, to claim it as their own, leaving me with nothing but the echo of their disbelief. This work, this revelation, was mine. It had chosen me. The lab, once my sanctuary, began to feel like a cage with invisible bars. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind against the windows, twisted into the sound of approaching footsteps. I found myself pausing mid-thought, my hand hovering over a console, listening, straining to discern the whisper of breath that wasn't my own, the faint rustle of fabric beyond the reinforced door. I started checking the locks obsessively, running my fingers over the cold metal, testing their resistance, even though I knew I'd secured them moments before. The air itself seemed to thicken, a palpable weight pressing down, as if the very space around me was being subtly warped by the signal's unseen influence, making my thoughts less my own, more exposed. One evening, as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, painting the lab in hues of bruised purple and gray, an insistent thought clawed at me. Had I left the calibration sequence for the resonant frequency modulator running? A minor detail, yet it nagged. The mist, thick and cloying, swallowed the familiar shapes of the houses, blurring them into indistinct phantoms. Street lights became halos of diffused light, their beams struggling to pierce the opaque shroud. The isolation was profound, a heavy cloak that wrapped around the car, muffling even the rumble of the engine. My own breath plumed before me, a ghost in the humid air. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, my gaze darting into the swirling gray, half expecting a shape to coalesce from the vapor, a silent watcher materializing from the ether. Finally, the dim porch light of my small house pierced the gloom. Inside, the silence was different from the lab's, a deeper, more personal hush. I moved through the familiar rooms, checking windows, running a hand over the cool glass, testing the latches. Everything seemed undisturbed, yet a prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. Had the back door been slightly ajar when I left this morning? I couldn't be sure. Sleep was a distant dream, a luxury I couldn't afford. The signal pulsed in my mind even without the screens, a phantom rhythm. I eventually returned to the lab, drawn by an invisible thread, needing to confirm that modulator calibration. The drive back through the still shrouded village was even more unnerving in the dead of night. The fog had deepened, pressing in so closely that my headlights carved only a shallow tunnel through the whiteness. It felt like sailing on a sea of milk, utterly blind, utterly alone. Back in the lab, the low hum of the servers was a comfort, a familiar heartbeat in the unsettling stillness. I went directly to the resonant frequency modulator, my mind still fixed on its calibration sequence. My fingers flew over the controls, bringing up the diagnostic readouts. And then I stopped. The internal frequency dampeners, a delicate array of micro-oscillators I had meticulously tuned myself, displayed a setting slightly, almost imperceptibly, off. A fractional shift, barely within the acceptable tolerance, but enough. Enough for me to know. My own hands, my own precise work, could not have produced this. I had last set them to 1.0000. Now, they read 1.0003. I knew my own equipment, the intimate language of its settings. Someone had been here. Someone had touched my work. This wasn't just about my findings, this was about my space, my sanctuary, my very perception of reality. The signal, I realized with a sickening lurch, was not just unraveling my mind, it was inviting others to witness the process. And they were already here. Sleep, when it finally claimed me, was not the balm I craved, but a descent into a landscape born of the signal's insidious geometry. I stood upon a precipice of something that was both stone and sky, a sheer face that defied gravity, curving inward upon itself like a colossal, petrified wave. Below me, not a valley, but a vortex of lightless abysses, were structures of unknown material perpetually rearranged, their angles shifting with a silent, grinding agony. These were not buildings, but concepts given form, rising and falling, never quite solid, never quite liquid, a perpetual state of becoming and unbecoming. The air itself tasted of metallic dust and the faint, acrid tang of ozone. A hum resonated through the impossible architecture, a low, persistent thrum that was not heard with ears, but felt in the marrow of my bones, a frequency that vibrated against the very notion of space. I saw its patterns woven into the tessellations of the impossible ground beneath my feet, in the way the light refracted into colors that did not exist in our spectrum, bleeding into one another with a terrifying fluidity. Then, they emerged. Not from any discernible direction, but from the spaces between spaces, from the negative contours of the shifting structures. Their forms defied Euclidean understanding. A limb might sprout from an impossible angle, or a segment of their being might fold in on itself, disappearing and reappearing an instant later, slightly altered. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, each movement a silent assertion of their otherness. My determination, even in this nightmare realm, flared. The hum intensified, vibrating now within my own chest, an echo of the signal's core. The creature's face, if such a term could apply, was a swirling gyre, and within its depths, I saw a reflection, not of myself, but of a vast, empty expanse, dotted with pinpricks of light that were not stars, but distant, silent screams. And then, a sound, not from the entity, but from the dream itself, a brittle, fracturing crack. It was the sound of something breaking, something fundamental, like glass under immense pressure. The air in the small, unfamiliar room was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a stark contrast to the ozone of my nightmare. The room was real, I told myself, clutching the rough wool blanket. The low ceiling, the peeling wallpaper, the narrow bed with its creaking frame. This was the rented room in the foggy village, miles from my isolated workshop, a place I'd sought out in a desperate, misguided attempt to clear my head, to escape the signal's relentless pull. The floor tilted slightly, or did it? My vision swam, the familiar lines of the room wavering, stretching. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, forcing the room back into its proper, Euclidean dimensions. It was an effort, a conscious wrestling match with my own perception. The splinter from the bird, I realized, was no longer a splinter. It was a deep, festering wound, poisoning my very wellspring of rest. Sleep offered no respite, only a deeper immersion into the very thing I sought to escape. The signal wasn't just influencing my thoughts, it was actively constructing my reality, even when I slept. The fog outside the window of the village room was a dense, milky curtain, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I stood, swaying, feeling the residual hum of the signal deep within my bones, a phantom vibration that would not cease. The dreams were no longer just dreams, they were an extension of the signal's reach, a new, terrifying front in its silent assault on my sanity. My instruments, usually stoic and reliable, seemed to hum with a restless energy, their dials occasionally quivering on their own, the readouts flickering with phantom numbers that dissolved before I could properly register them. A desperate craving for air untainted by the hum of my own machinery, for a sky unburdened by the weight of the signal, had driven me from my haven. My boots crunched on the whetstones, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. I walked past a baker's window, the warm glow within usually a beacon of normalcy. But as my gaze drifted across the pane, the glass seemed to ripple, not with the distortion of heat or moisture, but with an internal, viscous movement. The reflection of the street behind me stretched and compressed, the angles of the adjacent building briefly contorting into impossible, acute forms that defied perspective. I blinked, a sharp, involuntary jerk of my head, and the glass settled, reflecting only the mundane gray of the fog. My fingers, however, trembled as I tucked them into my coat pockets. Further down the lane, a weathered wooden sign creaked above a small chandlery. Its painted letters, a faded script advertising lamps and lanterns, began to swim before my eyes. The curves of the L stretched, the crossbar of the T elongated, until the entire word lantern seemed to unravel into a series of jagged, non-Euclidean strokes, reminiscent of the very patterns I was trying to decipher in the signal. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands against them until motes of light danced behind my eyelids. When I opened them, the sign was normal, swaying gently in the unseen breeze. The wood grain, though, seemed to hold a faint, lingering impression of the impossible geometry, like a ghost print on my retina. I needed to ground myself. I needed coffee. I pushed open the heavy oak door of a small inn, the bell above jingling with a sound that felt too bright, too sharp. The warmth inside was a welcome reprieve, but the relief was fleeting. The innkeeper, a stout, red-faced woman, was wiping down the counter with a cloth. As she turned to acknowledge me, her face, in that fleeting moment, seemed to stretch, her eyes elongating into unsettling ovals, her mouth widening into a rictus that was not a smile. It was a rapid, almost imperceptible shift, a momentary warping of flesh and bone that snapped back into familiar contours before I could fully process it. My stomach churned. She merely offered a placid, if tired, smile. "Just a coffee, Grant?" she asked, her voice perfectly normal, utterly devoid of the horror I had just witnessed. "Yes," I managed, my voice a dry rasp. "Black, please." I slid onto a stool, my gaze fixed on the polished wooden surface of the counter. The grain, usually a comforting swirl of brown and amber, began to shift. It wasn't just the play of light, the lines themselves were moving, flowing, rearranging into delicate, intricate patterns that defied the natural growth of wood. These were the very fractals, the recursive, self-similar geometries, that the signal had etched into my mind. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were here, on the surface of the world, bleeding into the mundane. This was the event. Not a grand catastrophe, but a quiet, insidious invasion of reality itself. The patterns, once confined to my screens, then to my subconscious, were now manifesting in my waking, objective world. The wood grain pulsed, a slow, organic breath of impossible design. It was as if the fabric of existence, usually so rigid and predictable, had become pliable, responding to an unseen pressure, reshaped by an alien chisel. Then came the reveal. It wasn't just my mind that was unraveling, it was the world around me. The signal wasn't merely influencing my perception, it was actively altering the physical environment, however subtly. The bird on my shoulder, the flickering readouts, the shifting glass, the warping sign, the innkeeper's face, this wooden counter, they were all symptoms. The comfortable illusion of a stable universe was a brittle shell, and the signal was tapping, gently, relentlessly, at its weakest points. I gripped the counter, the wood feeling strangely soft, yielding, as if it were about to melt away beneath my touch. "The natural order of things," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. The counters would grain, which had writhed like a nest of startled vipers, solidified once more into inert patterns. Had I truly seen it, or was it a phantom born of exhaustion, another trick of the light? I pressed the heels of my palms into my eyes, the pressure a dull throb behind my skull. When I looked again, the wood was still, inert, mocking. Yet, the memory of its undulation clung to me, a residue of impossible sight. My hands felt alien on the polished surface, rough and calloused in a way I didn't quite recall. Where was I? The question bloomed in my mind, a sudden, terrifying flower. This wasn't my lab. The air, thick with the scent of brine and damp earth, was utterly foreign. I stumbled toward a window, the glass opaque with condensation. Wiping a sleeve across it, I peered out into a swirling gray. A foggy village. That was the phrase that surfaced, unbidden, in my thoughts. A collection of squat, stone cottages huddled against a relentless, encroaching mist. How had I arrived here? The last coherent memory was the wood grain, then. A vast, echoing emptiness where hours, perhaps days, should have been. A sudden, sharp rap on a door behind me made me jump. A tall, stoic innkeeper stood in the doorway, a tray laden with a steaming mug and a plate of something savory in his hands. And your usual, of course. He placed the tray on a nearby table, the clatter jarring in the quiet room. My usual? I stared at the mug, then back at the innkeeper. Amusement, crossed his face. Indeed we have, Grant. Just this morning, over breakfast. You spoke at length about the strange patterns you'd been observing, the way the light bends in places it shouldn't. And yesterday, you were quite insistent on the room with the view of the docks, for optimal observation, you said. He gestured vaguely towards the window. Breakfast? Yesterday? My mind was a sieve, every attempt to grasp these supposed events met with the slick, unyielding wall of absence. I don't remember any of that, I confessed. The words tasting like ash. I don't remember coming here. The innkeeper's expression remained impassive. A long journey can do that, I suppose. You seemed quite preoccupied when you arrived. They was I? I felt a sudden urge to check my pockets, a desperate need for something familiar, something that could anchor me to a reality I still vaguely recognized. My fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. It was a page torn from a small notebook, scrawled with my own distinctive, hurried handwriting. The ink was fresh, still slightly smudged in places. Day 3 in the village. The signal is clearer here, amplified by the coastal mist. The patterns are no longer just visual, they are auditory, a low hum beneath the waves, a resonance in the very air. I must proceed to the old lighthouse by nightfall. The convergence point. Convergence point? Lighthouse? My breath caught in my throat. I had no memory of writing this, no recollection of these past 3 days. Yet, the words were undeniably mine, the pressure of the pen, the particular slant of the T's, the way I always underlined key phrases twice. What is that, Grant? The innkeeper asked, his voice softer now, laced with an unsettling concern. I crumpled the paper in my fist, the sharp edges digging into my palm. Nothing, I choked out, my voice raw. Just a note. But it wasn't just a note. Was he still me? The foggy village, the innkeeper's words, the note in my hand, they were all pieces of a terrifying mosaic, revealing not just a missing chunk of my life, but a terrifying fracture in my very self. The innkeeper's heavy tread echoed on the floorboards above, a familiar rhythm in the quietude of the foggy village. 3 days had bled into an indistinguishable haze since I found that note, a phantom limb of memory I could neither grasp nor dismiss. Sleep, a distant memory itself, offered no true rest, only fleeting glimpses of the signal's spiraling geometries etched onto the backs of my eyelids. My reflection in the grinding window pane was a stranger's face, hollowed eyes, a beard that had grown wild, skin taut over sharp bones. Yet, a fierce, almost manic determination pulsed beneath the exhaustion. My makeshift setup occupied the entire small table in the rented room. Wires snaked from the modified receiver, salvaged and re-engineered pieces of equipment, to a battered laptop whose screen glowed with the signal's raw, unfiltered output. It wasn't a spectrum of light, not a waveform of sound, but something else entirely, a cascade of patterns that shifted and reconfigured with an impossible logic, like a living, breathing tessellation. The very walls seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the data stream, expanding and contracting with each surge of non-Euclidean information. My fingers, numb and clumsy, danced across the keyboard, inputting parameters, running algorithms I barely recognized as my own. The previous Chen, the one who had written that note, must have been a genius, or a madman, or both. I was merely following the breadcrumbs of his obsession, hoping they wouldn't lead me over a precipice. The patterns on the screen began to accelerate, the intricate fractals blooming and collapsing with dizzying speed. My eyes burned, but I couldn't tear them away. The signal wasn't just data anymore, it was an experience, a visceral assault on my perception. It wasn't loud, but it resonated within my bones, vibrating through my skull until my teeth ached. The edges of the room began to waver, the wallpaper patterns subtly rearranging themselves, the wooden grain of the table shifting into impossible knots. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath fogging the cool glass. The patterns resolved into something new, something terrifyingly coherent. Not a language, not a code, but a fundamental structure, a blueprint for a reality that defied every axiom of my existence. It wasn't meant to be read, or translated, or understood in any human sense. It was. It simply existed, an undeniable truth from a place beyond comprehension. And I, by the sheer audacity of my observation, was forcing my mind to perceive it. The breakthrough struck me like a physical blow, a sudden, blinding flash of insight that ripped through the veil of my sanity. The signal wasn't a message to me. It wasn't an attempt at communication from some distant intelligence. It was merely there. It was the raw, unadulterated presence of an entity, a dimension, a fundamental aspect of existence that was never meant to be observed by anything with a human mind. Its very nature, when perceived, was anathema to the fragile scaffolding of reality my consciousness had constructed. It was like staring directly into the engine of a universe built on different physics, where space folded inward upon itself and time flowed in impossible directions. My brain, desperately trying to process the influx of non-Euclidean information, began to fracture. My jaw felt locked, my tongue a dry, useless thing. I was no longer in the in-room in the foggy village. I was everywhere and nowhere, a singular point of awareness adrift in an ocean of pure, undiluted existence that was utterly alien. The signal was not trying to communicate, it was simply being, and its being, when perceived, was a contagion that unmade the observer. My memories, my sense of self, my very grasp of what constituted real began to unravel, thread by agonizing thread. The Grand Chen who had sat at that table moments ago was dissolving, his identity melting into the impossible geometries, his sanity scattering like dust motes in an infinite, unfeeling wind. The fog outside the window seemed to press in, not as a physical mist, but as a boundless, gray oblivion that mirrored the encroaching emptiness within my skull. The signal, still pulsing on the laptop screen, was not a discovery, it was an infection. And I was its host, destined to become another echo in its infinite, incomprehensible hum. A cold, unyielding certainty settled in my chest. My determination, frayed by sleeplessness and the incessant pressure behind my eyes, tightened into a taut wire. The quaint, leaning houses that lined the thoroughfare were reduced to gray blurs, their windows like vacant eyes peering from the gloom. I walked, my boots finding an uncertain rhythm on the slick stones. The world narrowed to the immediate periphery, a gray tunnel. Then, through the swirling vapor, a shape solidified. It was a figure, slumped against the weathered wall of a fishmonger's shop, its face obscured by a tangle of matted hair and the low brim of a cap. The figure wasn't asleep, its head swayed with a slow, almost imperceptible motion, and a low, continuous murmur escaped its lips. The muttering resolved into fragmented words, a bizarre cadence. Dot the angles, they twist. Always. The space between. It breathes. The voice was raspy, dry, as if unused for long stretches of time. It spoke of geometry, but not as I knew it. It spoke of space not as emptiness, but as something sentient, something that breathed. These were echoes of the signal, the very language I'd been wrestling with in my lab, now spilling from the lips of a stranger on a deserted street. Further down, near the deserted docks where the fishing boats bobbed like ghosts, another figure sat on an overturned crate. This one was older, with skin like dried parchment stretched over sharp bones. Its gaze, when it lifted towards the unseen horizon, was utterly vacant, yet held a terrifying intensity, as if seeing beyond the fog, beyond the village, into realms I could only glimpse in my nightmares. Its hands, gnarled and trembling, were perpetually tracing intricate, non-repeating patterns in the damp air, a silent, frantic calligraphy of impossible shapes. The folds. The folds. They open. And close. Never the same. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular beat against my ribs. It was as if I had stumbled into a gallery of my own future. These weren't simply broken people, they were reflections, distorted mirrors showing me the inevitable destination of this journey. Their eyes, their movements, their disjointed words, they were all symptoms of the same affliction, the same unraveling of sanity, touched by the same unseen force that was slowly, meticulously dismantling my own mind. A third figure appeared then, leaning against a lamp post, its form silhouetted against the swirling gray. It was younger, perhaps, its face still retaining a semblance of youth, but its eyes were ancient, brimming with an unbearable weariness. It didn't speak in words, but in a low, continuous hum, a tone that vibrated with a specific, unsettling frequency, a frequency that felt excruciatingly familiar, a tone that resonated with the very core of the signal I had first detected. It was a sound I had heard in my own head, in the moments before the hallucinations truly took hold. The hum was a revelation, not of information, but of terrifying confirmation. This wasn't a random collection of lost souls. They were all connected, all tuned to the same distorted frequency, their minds shattered by the same impossible patterns. The fog, the isolation, the forgotten nature of the village, it wasn't just scenery, it was a refuge, or perhaps a prison, for those who had seen too much, heard too much. This was what awaited me, what had already begun to claim me. The path I was on led here, to this quiet, desolate corner, to a life of muttering fragments and tracing impossible geometries in the air. The horror was not in the unknown, but in the sudden, stark recognition of the known. My determination solidified, hardening into a desperate, terrifying resolve. The question was no longer if I was unraveling, but how to stop it, before I, too, became another whisper in the endless fog. I sat by the window, watching the perpetual mist that clung to the cobblestones outside. It was a shroud, thick and impartial, yet in these last hours, it had begun to pulse with a subtle, internal light, like a vast, unseen heart beating just beyond the glass. The gray uniformity of the fog would ripple, then stretch into impossible geometries, forming fleeting, multifaceted planes that seemed to fold space upon itself. A distant lamppost would appear simultaneously at the end of the lane and directly across the square, its light a smeared, elongated smear of orange that defied all laws of perspective. The very air in the room, once so solid and still, now vibrated with a faint, high-pitched hum, a sound not heard by the ears but felt in the hollows of my bones. I clenched my fists, knuckles white. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern, began to undulate, the roses on it blooming into forms that were not flowers but intricate, crystalline structures, their petals spiraling inward into voids of absolute darkness. This was no mere trick of the light, no fleeting fatigue. This was a sustained, conscious assault on the very architecture of my mind. It was learning me, mapping the contours of my perception, and then, with surgical precision, beginning to dismantle them. I pushed myself away from the window, the old wooden chair scraping loudly on the floorboards. I heard it reverberate for an impossibly long time, a lonely, metallic shriek that curdled the air. My gaze fell upon the pitcher of water on the table, its surface usually a placid mirror. Now, the water stirred of its own accord, not with ripples, but with slow, viscous eddies that seemed to trace out the very non-Euclidean patterns I had once sought to decipher. Shapes formed and dissolved within its depths, impossible geometries, shifting angles that suggested dimensions beyond my comprehension. It stared at me, unblinking, its gaze not one of curiosity, but of ancient, indifferent hunger. This was the event, the eye in the water solidified, growing, until the entire picture became a single, liquid orb of pure observation. It pulsed with a sickening, internal luminescence, its depths revealing not merely water, but entire landscapes of alien topography, mountains that were simultaneously valleys, skies that were oceans. And within those landscapes, tiny, indistinct forms writhed, creatures of pure thought, made manifest in the liquid lens. They were not flesh and blood, but concepts given form, their movements defying momentum or gravity, their existence a testament to a reality fundamentally different from my own. I staggered back, knocking over the chair. It fell with a clatter that was swallowed by the hum. The walls warped, their lines bending and twisting, the corners of the room becoming acute angles that converged into nothingness, then obtuse angles that stretched into infinity. My own hands, when I held them before my face, seemed to ripple, their outlines blurring, my fingers elongating, then shrinking, then merging with the swirling patterns of the air. The signal wasn't just showing me another reality, it was becoming my reality. It wasn't merely influencing my perception, it was rewriting it, layer by painstaking layer. This was the reveal, the signal didn't exist beyond the known universe, it was the unknown universe, and it had found a way to bridge the chasm. It wasn't an external entity reaching in, it was an internal transformation, subtly altering the very architecture of my consciousness, making me a conduit, a living gateway for its manifestation. I was not merely observing the unraveling, I was the unraveling. The boundary between Grant Chen and the entity's dimension had not merely thinned, it had ceased to exist. I was a fractured mirror, reflecting an impossible truth. And the eye in the water, a window into a reality I was rapidly becoming a part of, blinked. But this morning, a raw, desperate clarity sliced through the miasma. A cold, hard edge of resolve, born from the terror of utter dissolution, had settled within me. My fingers, trembling like autumn leaves, fumbled with the worn rotary dial of the inn's ancient wall phone. I remembered the number, a relic from a life now seeming impossibly distant, a life where numbers held meaning and gravity was a constant. Now, I prayed he might still possess enough of that open curiosity to listen, truly listen, to the madness that had consumed me. The line crackled, a nest of static attempting to smother the nascent hope within my chest. Then, a voice, crisp and professional, answered. Operator. How may I direct your call? Dr. Eris Thorne, I croaked, my throat raw. Please. It's urgent. A pause, a rustle of paper, then the familiar sequence of tones as the connection was made. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for release. The ring, once, twice, 3 times. Then, a voice, familiar yet distant, laced with a polite weariness. Thorne. Eris? It's Grant. Grant Chen. My voice was a stranger's, thin and reedy. A longer pause this time, a discernible shift in the air, even across the miles. Grant? Good heavens. I haven't heard from you in. What, months? Are you all right? We were starting to worry. His tone was kind, but tinged with an underlying concern that felt less like camaraderie and more like distant pity. No, Eris, I'm not all right, I blurted, the words tumbling out, a torrent I couldn't stem. It's the signal. The one from beyond the great filter. It's not a signal, not really. It's a fracture. It's dissolving everything. My mind, my memories, the very contours of reality itself. The patterns, Eris, they're non-Euclidean, they defy the very axioms of space. It's leaking into this world, twisting it. I see things. Things that shouldn't be. Silence stretched, taut and suffocating. I could almost hear the gears turning in his brilliant mind, attempting to parse my frantic, fragmented plea. Grant, he began, his voice softer now, more measured, I understand you've been under a lot of pressure. The isolation, the intensity of your research. It can take a toll. We all worried when you left so abruptly. Perhaps you should consider taking a break. A proper one. A break? I laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that scraped against my ears. Eris, you don't understand. This isn't stress. This isn't a breakdown. This is an invasion. The signal, it's a wound in existence. It's tearing the seams. I saw it, in the patterns, the way they shifted, the way they breathed. It's a living equation, a geometry of madness. Grant. Listen to me, his voice grew firmer, tinged now with an almost paternal exasperation. The signal, as far as our instruments show, is still a fascinating, albeit complex, anomaly. There's no indication of what you're describing. No physical manifestation, no fracture. Perhaps you've been working too hard. Your mind might be rational. The word hung in the air, a judgment, a dismissal. He was not hearing me. He was hearing a man unraveling, not a man witnessing the unraveling of the cosmos. "You have to believe me, Eris," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "The notes I sent, the data, the projections. Did you look at the last set? The ones on the topological distortions? The ones that showed the collapse of spatial coherence?" Another sigh. "We received your last package, Grant. It was dense. And frankly, a little concerning. The equations were highly unconventional, almost philosophical. There were no discernible physical correlates. We thought perhaps you'd taken a creative turn." Creative turn. He saw poetry where I saw annihilation. He saw metaphor where I saw the stark, horrifying truth. The fog. It's not just weather. It's a veil. It's spreading. I gripped the receiver, my knuckles white, watching as a tendril of mist outside the window seemed to coil and uncoil, like a living thing, against the glass. It pressed inward, a silent, knowing presence. "Grant, I'm going to hang up now," Eris said, his voice laced with unmistakable pity. "I truly think you need to seek some help. Take care of yourself." Then, a click. The line went dead. My eyes were wide, bloodshot, haunted. I was utterly alone. No one believed. No one could even comprehend. As I slowly replaced the receiver, the innkeeper's heavy tread resumed its rhythm above, but it sounded different now. Less human, more like the slow, deliberate thud of something vast and ancient shifting its weight. And I was trapped within it. A hollow ache bloomed in my chest, more profound than any physical wound, a void where certainty had once resided. The dead receiver, a cold stone in my palm, mirrored the sudden emptiness within me. The air in my small dwelling grew heavy, thick with unspoken questions, with the residue of a truth I couldn't grasp. My feet moved without conscious command. The floorboards groaned beneath me, each creak a lament for a sanity now fractured. I stepped out, not knowing where I was going, only that the oppressive stillness of my room was a cage, and the fog outside, a beckoning shroud. The world beyond my door was a monochrome wash, a canvas bled of color and definition. Each breath I drew felt like inhaling fragments of a dream. I walked. Hours might have passed, or mere moments. Time had become a fluid, meaningless concept, stretching and compressing like a distorted image. The ground beneath my worn boots grew uneven, the scent of brine mingling with the damp earth, signaling a shift in my surroundings. Then, through the shifting veils of mist, a silhouette materialized. Not a single structure, but a cluster of them, huddled together like ancient, stoic guardians. This was it, the place that had whispered to me in my fractured thoughts, the destination that felt both inevitable and utterly alien, the foggy village. The buildings here were not merely old, they seemed to defy the simple geometries of my world. The fog, rather than merely obscuring, seemed to emanate from the very stones, swirling with an internal luminescence that pulsed faintly, like the slow, rhythmic beat of a colossal, hidden heart. A cobblestone path, slick with moisture, unwound before me. No birds sang, no wind rustled through unseen trees, no distant hum of machinery. My determination, once a sharp, guiding needle, was now a dull, persistent ache, urging me forward into the unreality. I had to understand, even if understanding meant shedding my very self. The lines of the houses twisted and reformed before my eyes, straight edges becoming gentle arcs, corners folding inward upon themselves in ways that defied perspective. A distant bell tower, half obscured by the mist, seemed to stretch and contract, its peak drawing itself into a point that simultaneously existed in multiple places. My breath hitched. My mind struggled, then surrendered. I was seeing the world not as Grand Chen, but as something else, something vast and ancient, peering through my eyes. A narrow lane opened into a central square, dominated by a monolithic stone monument, its surface worn smooth by ages of wind and rain. But as I approached, the monument began to ripple, its solid stone dissolving into a shimmering, gelatinous surface. And then, within the vortex, a shape began to coalesce. It was the signal, made manifest. Not in sound, not in light, but in a direct communion with my thoughts. You sought understanding, Grand Chen. The voice was not auditory, it was an intrusion, a vast, echoing presence within the confines of my skull, reverberating through every synapse, every memory. An understanding is granted. My knees buckled. My skin tingled, my fingers felt elongated, my very bones seemed to hum with an alien frequency. My identity, that fragile construct of memories and experiences, began to fray at the edges. I tried to grasp a thought, a name, my name, but it slipped away like sand through open fingers. Grand Chen. Was that a name? A designation? A temporary vessel? The monument pulsed, and the village around me dissolved further, the impossible geometries becoming fluid, merging with the fog, with the air itself. I was no longer standing on cobblestones, I was floating in a sea of pure pattern, of shifting angles and colors unseen by human eyes. You are a lens, the vast thought echoed, resonating with a terrifying finality. A point of observation. A gateway. My vision blurred, not with tears, but with the sheer overwhelming data flooding my senses. My body felt insubstantial, a mere echo of a form. I looked down at my hands, and they were not my hands. They were translucent, shimmering with the same impossible patterns that danced in the air, stretching, reforming, becoming something vast and uncontainable. I was no longer Grand Chen. I was a vessel, a conduit, a whisper in the mind of something ancient, something that now perceived the universe through my dissolving eyes, its own impossible perspective made real through the shattered fragments of my sanity. The foggy village, the earth, the stars, they were all just patterns now, flowing into and through me, an endless, terrifying tide. They shimmered, not with blood and muscle, but with the impossible geometry that had haunted my screens, now dancing in the air, stretching, elongating, like reflections on a disturbed surface. My body was a suggestion, a fading sketch. Then, a shift. The roar attenuated into a muffled hush, and the swirling grays coalesced into an oppressive, pearlescent shroud. I stood, or seemed to stand, on ground that felt like damp earth beneath my feet, though I could not quite feel the pressure. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and the scent of decay, wet stone, forgotten wood, and something metallic, like ancient blood. I was in a foggy village. The fog was not mere weather, it felt alive, a breathing entity that swallowed sound and form. Huts of rough-hewn stone and timber emerged from the vapor, their roofs sagging under invisible burdens, their windows like vacant eyes. No light spilled from within, only deeper shades of gloom. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of unseen water and the faint, rhythmic creak of something ancient swaying in the unseen breeze. My lungs drew in the heavy air, but it felt insubstantial, as if I were breathing mist itself. A shape stirred in the distance, a hunched form emerging from the fog's embrace. Their face, when they drew closer, was obscured by the swirling vapor, yet I sensed a gaze fixed upon me. The villager continued their slow, deliberate path. Passing through a patch of fog that momentarily rendered them transparent, their form rippling with the same non-Euclidean patterns that now adorned my own fading hands. They didn't acknowledge me, didn't break their stride, a ghost moving through a dream. The signal. Memories flickered, fragmented, like dying embers. My name, Chen, felt distant, a label for a different self. What was I searching for? What had I found? The urgency that had driven me for months was a dull ache, overshadowed by a growing sense of dissolution. I stumbled forward, drawn by an invisible current, deeper into the village. The wood felt soft, yielding, almost fluid. In the center of the village square, where a well should have stood, was a monolith of rough, unidentifiable stone. It pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, a soft, almost imperceptible thrum that vibrated not in the air, but directly in my dissolving awareness. The patterns, the impossible geometries, were etched into its surface, shifting and reforming, a silent, cosmic dance. This was it. The source, or perhaps, the ultimate receiver. I reached out, my shimmering hand phasing through the air. As my fingers neared the stone, the patterns on my skin flared, becoming more defined, more insistent. My vision blurred, not with tears, but with the overwhelming influx of information that was no longer merely data, but a raw, unmediated reality. I saw not with my eyes, but with every fiber of my being, which was rapidly becoming pure pattern. Reveal/discovery, the signal wasn't a message from beyond the known universe, it was the unknown universe, leaking through. It wasn't an anomaly, but the fundamental truth of existence, a tapestry of impossible geometries that our limited senses could never comprehend, until now. My perception hadn't been distorted, it had been unveiled. The universe was not Euclidean, not solid, not even truly there in any way I had ever understood. It was a fluid, shifting, infinite pattern, and I, Chen, had merely glimpsed its true face. As my translucent fingers touched the monolith, the stone offered no resistance. My hand passed through it, and then my arm, and then my entire being began to flow, to unravel, to disperse. The foggy village, the stone huts, the shuffling villager, they too were patterns, larger, slower, but ultimately the same. There was no pain, only an infinite expansion, a merging. I was the shimmering light, the impossible geometry, the silent thrum. Chen ceased to be a name, a memory, a form. It was full, overflowing with a silent, incomprehensible logic, and I was merely a single, ephemeral ripple in its eternal, unfolding design. Then, even that understanding dissolved, becoming another facet of the pattern, indistinguishable from the rest. The fog, the village, the very concept of I melted into an infinite, silent hum.